Today is day 2 of our discussion of metabolism, and we're going to start with lipid metabolism. The most abundant lipid in the body are triglycerides. And the body can use triglycerides to produce energy. So lipids, like triglycerides, will go through the process of lipolysis to produce ATP. They will either get broken down into pyruvate, or they will get broken down directly into acetyl-CoA. If they're broken down into pyruvate, pyruvate will be broken down into acetyl-CoA, just like we saw in glycolysis where a carbon is removed, and then acetyl-CoA will move into the citric acid cycle. Then all those hydrogen from the citric acid cycle will be taken to the electron transport system to create the conditions to make ATP. So let's take a look at what a triglyceride is. A triglyceride has a glycerol head, and it has 3 fatty acid tails. Now these fatty acid tails are chains of carbons. When the triglyceride gets broken down, it'll be broken down into the glycerol head and the 3 individual fatty acid tails or chains. So let's take a look at that molecule then that's been broken down. We have the glycerol head and the 3 fatty acid chains. And so from one fatty acid tail, if it contained 18 carbons, so we see that the fatty acid tails, these fatty acid chains, actually hold a lot more carbons than what glucose did. Glucose only had 6 carbons. This fatty acid tail would on average have about 18 carbons. So from one 18 carbon fatty acid, that would yield 9 acetyl-CoA. And from 9 acetyl-CoA, that will yield around 90 to 96 ATP from one fatty acid tail. Now that is 0.3 times more than glucose gave us. So if you remember, glucose was only 6 carbons. So each of those carbons on glucose are going to have hydrogen attached to them, which can be removed and carried off to the electron transport system, where they can be used to create those conditions to make ATP. The fatty acids have 18 carbons in those tails, so they just have a lot more hydrogen that will help to yield more ATP. So in order to yield the same amount of ATP, you would need 3 glucose molecules for every 1 fatty acid to yield the same amount of ATP. Okay, let's talk a little bit about lipid anabolism. Okay, so lipogenesis, lipid formation of, right? This is the formation of lipids or the formation of triglycerides. Triglycerides are stored in adipose tissue. So when does your body form triglycerides? Well, we know that it is stimulated by a diet high in carbohydrates, it's also stimulated by the hormone insulin. And insulin will be released whenever you have a diet high in carbohydrates. Some lipids can be made in the body, just like we had with glucose. We saw glucose could be produced through the process of gluconeogenesis. And so some lipids can be produced in the body, but some lipids can't be produced in the body. For example, the linoleic and linolenic acids. These lipids come from plants, and so they are not produced in your body. They can't be produced in the body. So any of the lipids that you have to get from your diet, those are called essential fatty acids. The ones that your body produces are called non-essential fatty acids. So non-essential fatty acids are fatty acids your body can produce. Lipids are stored as little compact molecules. So they're very hard to get at, so the body doesn't really like to use those first. They're processed in the mitochondria where oxygen is limited, and the lipids need to have oxygen in order to create those ATP. So this isn't going to be the first choice for your body to use. Your body's first choice for fuel is glucose. But glucose metabolism will shift to lipid metabolism when glucose supply is low. It also will shift to lipid metabolism when energy demands are low as well. So now let's start talking about protein metabolism. As we know, proteins are made of amino acids, chains of amino acids. Amino acids are linked together by peptide bonds. Right? And so these peptide bonds would have to be broken in order to liberate one of the amino acids in order to break that down to use it for energy. There are only 20 different amino acids in your body. And from those 20 different amino acids, we can rearrange them. We can have different lengths of them by adding more amino acids. And so with just the 20 different amino acids in the body can make 100,000 to 140,000 different proteins. So to get ATP from one amino acid, the amino acid has to be converted to a different substance. So an amino acid would be converted to glucose or a fatty acid or a ketone body. And then these things can enter into the citric acid cycle. Right, so there's 3 different processes to do this conversion. We're going to talk about each one of these. There's a process called transamination. There's a process called deamination. And then there's a process called the Urea Cycle. We'll start by talking about transamination. Transamination is a process that the cells of the liver and skeletal muscle, cells of the heart, the lungs, the kidney, and the brain all use to convert amino acids to glucose. In transamination, an amino group is removed from an amino acid and then it's transferred to a keto acid. Then we end up with a new keto acid and a new amino acid. The new keto acid enters the cytosol and the new amino acid enters the citric acid cycle. So let's take a look at what I'm talking about. So we have an amino acid, and let's just say that amino acid is glutamic acid. Okay, so the body can't use that. Glutamic acid can't enter into the citric acid cycle, so it has to go through this process called transamination. And an amino group is taken off of this amino acid and it's transferred to a keto acid. So an amino group is transferred. So now we have a keto acid 1 will bond to this amino group and it'll become a different keto acid. And the amino acid loses that amino group and it becomes another amino acid. And so the amino acid that it would become is tyrosine. Now tyrosine is an amino acid that can enter into the citric acid cycle. So that goes through the citric acid cycle and then that produces ATP. The other keto acid then, keto acid 2, is just going to enter into the cytosol from the mitochondria. The second process is called deamination. During deamination, an amino group is removed again, but in this process, it's not involving the keto acids. Instead, by removing an amino group, an organic acid is formed. But at the same time that the organic acid is formed, ammonia is also formed, and the ammonium ion is toxic. It's toxic to the cells. So then the liver enzymes have to convert the ammonium ion into urea, which is not toxic. When the ammonium ion is produced from the deamination of amino acids, we have to get rid of that ammonium ion because it's toxic. And so ammonium ion will enter into what we call the urea cycle. And in the urea cycle, it combines with carbon dioxide. And together then they produce a waste product that's called urea. Urea is not toxic, whereas ammonium ions were very toxic. So now the kidneys can excrete urea. So those are the three processes that occur with protein catabolism. The body likes to break down proteins only when the glucose supply is low. So basically, proteins are not a great source of energy. First, glucose levels will be broken down to produce ATP, and then lipids will be broken down to produce ATP, and proteins will only be broken down if the glucose supply is low and if the lipids are inadequate. So the liver is going to be breaking down these proteins, and they break down internal proteins within the liver. So breaking down proteins to produce ATP is actually very impractical. There are 3 reasons why it's impractical to use proteins for energy. So first of all, proteins are more difficult to break apart. Second of all, the byproduct ammonium ion is toxic. So we wouldn't want to break down proteins for that reason. And the third reason is that breaking down proteins threatens homeostasis. You're basically breaking apart the cells of your body in order to produce ATP. So that's going to cause some type of organ disorder, organ failure. So it's not a great idea to try to use protein to get your energy. Like I said before, there are 20 amino acids in your body, and 10 of those amino acids come from your diet. And so those we call essential amino acids. Think of it this way, it's essential to eat these and get these, otherwise you're not going to have them. Your body can't make them, so it's essential that you eat them. Of these 10, 8 of these your body cannot make. And 2 of these your body doesn't make in a high enough quantity for a growing child. Then 10 of these are non-essential amino acids. And these are amino acids that your body can make through anabolism. And when we are producing new proteins, that process is called amination. Okay, this ends our lecture on metabolism.